Do you like getting into detailed discussions about movies, TV shows, or video games? Then this is the place you need to be. I'm Adam Davidson, and welcome to the debut episode of Entertainment Talk. Welcome, guys, to Entertainment Talk. Halloween is right around the corner, and I couldn't think of a better topic for this first episode than a horror movie franchise. But I'm not going to talk about Halloween. Now, that's a future episode. But I do want to talk about another franchise based around another very scary date. I'm talking about Friday the 13th. The Friday the 13th franchise has been around since 1980 and has introduced us to one of the most famous horror icons of all time, Jason Voorhees. The Friday the 13th franchise is your basic slasher films, known for its blood and gore, its unique kills, and of course your sexy women and sex scenes and nude scenes. Now, some people out there are huge fans of this series. Some only like a few movies, some absolutely hate it, some think it never should have made it as far as it did, and you might all be right for your own reasons. But after looking up some information, it might be easier to like the series if you knew a bit about it. So Friday the 13th came out in 1980. Now, yeah, nowadays we all know who Jason Voorhees is. But back then, nobody knew who Jason Voorhees was. No one knew that they were going into the theater to watch the first installment of what would grow into a massive franchise. When you were first watching it, it almost seemed like one of those whodunit type movies where it could have been any of the cast members, with possibly the biggest suspects being either crazy old Ralph,
It's got a death curse!
or Steve Christy himself. You see Steve Christy sitting in a Jeep getting ready to leave the camp. Well, you also see Annie getting picked up by someone in a Jeep who eventually goes on to kill her. It is until later on in the movie that you see Steve Christy get killed that you're like, okay, it wasn't him. Then later on in the movie, we get to meet Mrs. Voorhees, who would end up telling Alice the story of Jason, about her boy drowning in Camp Crystal Lake.
Did you know that a young boy drowned the year before those two others were killed?
Well, we had already heard earlier in that movie at least a small little smidget of that.
Did Christy tell you about the two kids murdered in 58? Huh? Boy drowning in 57?
Who would have thought that these two were like little hints at what the franchise was going to turn into? The movie would end with Alice, the sole survivor, decapitating Mrs. Voorhees, then getting into a canoe and canoeing out into the middle of the lake, where eventually she's attacked by what could be described as a decomposed body of a child, maybe? Eventually she wakes up in the hospital wanting to know what the hell's going on and what happened to the boy.
Ma'am, we didn't find any boy.
Then he's still there.
Suddenly, the camera's zooming in on what looks to be air ripples in the middle of the lake. What a perfect ending! It wouldn't be until a year later in the sequel that we would finally be introduced to Jason himself. However, he doesn't resemble the Jason that we all know and love today, but actually looked like he belonged in the movie The Hills Have Eyes. With the plaid shirt, the overalls, the sack over his head, armed with a pitchfork, and living in a shed in the middle of the woods. He actually looked a lot like Crazy Ralph, and had Crazy Ralph not been killed early in the movie, we probably would have suspected it being him. It wouldn't be until the third installment that Jason finally donned the famous hockey mask. Now, many people out there believe that this series went on for way too long, and are probably going to be upset to know that originally Paramount Pictures were going to end the series with Friday the 13th Part 3. However, a new idea of a direction of where the series could go would lead them to create future installments. A year later, we would get Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter. Now here's the question, why would it be labeled a final chapter if a year later they released a new movie? Well, as it turns out, it was the final chapter for Jason Voorhees, the final chapter of the original franchise and the beginning of the new portion of the franchise. You see, Friday the 13th Part 4, which in my personal opinion was the best of the series, introduced a few new concepts. Up until that point, it was nothing more than a cast of horny teenagers. Well, in this one, they decided to introduce the first family, the Jarvis family, a single mother raising her older daughter Trish and young son Tommy. Paramount Pictures wanted to introduce a group of cast members that the fans didn't want to see killed. Also, this would be the first installment in which had actually two survivors at the end of the movie, Tommy and his older sister Trish. The movie would end with Tommy beating the hell out of Jason's body with his own machete, then later on hugging his sister Trish in the hospital before looking up at the camera with a very evil look. A year later, we got Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, which was deemed one of the worst in the series. And maybe it's because a lot of people didn't understand what the movie was supposed to do. I'm not saying that understanding it will make it any better, but at least you'll understand it better. In this one, Tommy Jarvis, now fully grown, is now taken to a clinic in the middle of the woods where he will attempt to learn to get back into society. He's still plagued with all the memories of what happened when he was younger and even sees hallucinations. Eventually, the killings start back up. Now, I believe the sole purpose of this movie was to have the viewers actually pointing fingers at Tommy, making them believe that Tommy was the one doing the killings, and it's easy to see why. Early in the movie, Tommy ends up having a confrontation with a guy named Eddie, who ended up taking one of Tommy's homemade masks and used it to scare him. Tommy would get angry, flip Eddie over, and start beating the living hell out of him. Later on, Tommy, looking down from his window, would see Tina and Eddie messing around and suddenly see the hallucination of Jason again. Sure enough, Eddie and Tina would be killed. Then later on in the movie, Tommy would get into a physical bout with the neighbor woman's son, beating him down, then running off in a fit of rage. Suddenly, the bodies start piling up, including in his own bedroom. So again, it truly looked as if Tommy was the real killer. Well, as it would turn out, Tommy was not at all the killer, as he would emerge at the end of the movie to help Reggie and Pam fight off Jason. But it would turn out not only was Tommy not Jason, but Jason wasn't Jason, as instead it was a paramedic, dressed up as Jason to get revenge for the death of his own son earlier in the movie. However, the movie would end with Tommy seemingly accepting his fate as the new killer, would even put on Jason's mask and hold up a knife looking as if he was going to stab Pam before the movie went to credits. So the sole purpose of this movie was to make people believe that Tommy was the killer, even though he wasn't, but eventually turn Tommy into the killer, leaving Jason Voorhees in the past. The movie would get bad reviews, and a lot of the reason was because Jason Voorhees wasn't part of the movie. Because of that, Paramount Pictures decided to scrap the idea of turning Tommy Jarvis into the next killer. So they decided to bring Jason Voorhees back, but they needed to do something completely different. So they decided to go a little bit more of a supernatural way, even inviting supernatural writers and directors in for the 6th installment, Jason Lives. In this one, Tommy Jarvis makes his return in an attempt to destroy Jason's body. However, after stabbing it with a metal rod, the metal rod is struck by lightning, bringing Jason back to life. Now, Jason is no longer just a deformed man, but instead more of a deformed zombie that seems unstoppable. Now, Friday the 13th Part 6 was actually a really good movie. In fact, due to the reviews, it was actually deemed the best movie in the series since the original, and it had an amazing ending. Tommy Jarvis, realizing he couldn't kill Jason, decided to trap him at the bottom of Camp Crystal Lake for all time. It seemed perfect. In my personal opinion, Friday the 13th Part 5 should have been labeled The Final Chapter and given the storyline of Friday the 13th Part 6. Boom. 5 movies, great story, a great ending, and a franchise. But nope, keep rolling the franchises out, and Paramount Pictures would do so. They would give us the 7th installment, Friday the 13th Part 7, A New Blood, in which a young girl named Tina, armed with telekinetic powers, would accidentally release Jason from his underwater prison. The killings would commence, and Tina would have to learn to use her powers and control them so that she could use them to fight against Jason and shut him down for all time. Then Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Took Manhattan. In this movie, the Paramount Pictures decided to take Jason out of his natural habitat and partially put him on a ship and partially put him on the streets of Manhattan because, you know, someone that looked like Jason could easily blend in with the New York crowd. Apparently. Friday the 13th Part 8 would be the final installment that was released by Paramount Pictures before they realized that there was nowhere else they could go with the franchise and finally decided to sell the rights to New Line Cinema, the same studio that gave us A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now with ownership of both horror franchises, it was in 2003 that New Line Cinema would give us the crossover between Freddy and Jason. But as it turns out, it took a lot to get to that point. What a lot of people don't realize is the Freddy vs. Jason movie was actually planned back in the early 80s. However, neither studio wanted to give up the rights to their movie, nor could they come up with a good idea. So, basically the idea just floated around. But now that they had the rights to Friday the 13th, they could finally get started and would release Jason Goes to Hell the final Friday in 1993. This would be the worst movie in the series. Where Paramount Pictures always had their Friday the 13th movies pick up right where the last one left off, New Line Cinema started Jason Goes to Hell basically just in the middle of nowhere. Friday the 13th Part 8 ended with Jason getting drowned in a bunch of toxic waste in the sewers underneath Manhattan, and symbolically, I guess, was transformed back into his child self. So basically the curse was lifted? I don't know. But Jason Goes to Hell would actually start up with Jason looking the exact same way, chasing a smoking hot girl through the woods. No big deal. The story itself was absolutely terrible. This would introduce Supernatural, not in a good way. First, we would be introduced to the fact that Jason now has a house. That's right. Hey, why not? Freddy has a house, so yep. We get introduced to the Voorhees house. Also, we find out that Jason has a sister. And we also find out that there is a bounty hunter out there named Clayton Duke who apparently knows how to kill Jason. And he eventually reveals that only a Voorhees by blood can kill Jason. How he learned this information, we never know. Eventually, however, it's all this mystic dagger, and you gotta stab it into Jason's heart and officially kill him once and for all. I mean, what the hell? Early in the movie, Jason ends up killing his sister, which ends up leaving his sister's daughter, Jason's niece, Jessica, and her baby being the only Voorhees alive. So only one of those two could kill Jason. Well, also in this one, Jason's only in the movie for maybe 20 minutes, if that. He appears at the very beginning of the movie, but he's set up in a trap and a bunch of SWAT guys end up blowing his body up. Eventually, his body pieces are taken to a morgue where they're to be studied. The heart suddenly starts pumping. It hypnotizes the coroner, who ends up eating it and becomes possessed by Jason and starts going on a killing spree. Okay, not exactly the best idea, but let's have a look at a lot of the shittiness of this. First, since when does Jason give a crap about what he looks like? In this movie, he ends up actually capturing a cop, stripping down his clothes, strapping him to the table, shaving him, possessing him, then putting his clothes back on. What the hell? Also, later on in the movie, he ends up possessing yet another deputy, who he's able to talk. Through the entire movie, through the entire franchise, Jason never talks. Suddenly, he takes over another deputy, and he's able to talk, and he's holding a gun. Okay, here's Jason trying to kill Jessica, basically to keep himself from ever being able to get killed. He's holding a gun. He could easily kill Jessica. Why the hell didn't he? Finally, Jason ends up managing to use Jessica's dead mother's body to be reborn at the end of the movie. Okay. He then goes toe-to-toe with main character Steven, a very geeky main role. How many times in the entire horror franchise of Friday the 13th did you see somebody attempt to go one-on-one with Jason? 99.9% of the time, they all died. The only person who managed to survive? Tommy. Well, it turns out that this geek managed to hold out just long enough for Jessica to get the mystic dagger and stab it into Jason's heart and officially kill him. You see all these hands come out of the ground and this light beam down, and Jason gets dragged down, seemingly to hell. What the hell did I just watch? This entire crappy movie was to set up one particular scene, the final 30 seconds, in which you see Jason's mask lying in the dirt, and you suddenly see Freddy's arm come out of the dirt, grab Jason's mask, and laugh as it pulls Jason's mask underground. Okay, I don't want to dissect this too much, but is that possible, considering the fact that Freddy's part of the dream world and Jason's mask was part of the real world? But okay, I get it. It was an Easter egg to set up for the future movie. But here's the thing. That future movie, it wasn't anywhere in the near future. So New Line Cinema had been thinking of a Freddy vs. Jason movie since the early 80s, planning it out and everything, but the only thing that was holding them back was the fact that they didn't have the rights to Friday the 13th. Now they do, and technology is there and everything, the movie can happen, and yet what's holding them back? The fact that they couldn't come up with a decent script or story. Okay? Well, 8 years would pass after Jason Goes to Hell, and New Line Cinema still couldn't get the movie off the ground, but they wanted to keep Jason fresh in the minds of fans. So they released Jason X, the 10th installment of the series. This did everything but keep Jason fresh. Okay, again, New Line Cinema would start it out basically in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it didn't pick up after Jason Goes to Hell or anything like that. Instead, we just see Jason, now looking bigger and newer and everything, captured by the military. How the hell did he get captured? We don't know. He's eventually cryogenically frozen, 400 years later found by a group of students visiting from what is now Earth 2, who take him on board a spaceship where he defrosts and goes on a killing spree. He eventually gets into a one-on-one battle with an android, loses, but accidentally lands on a medical bed that sparks to life, and next thing you know, he becomes a cyborg. Okay, I'm not saying that this movie was 100% terrible, but when you take an icon like Jason, who started out as like a hermit in the middle of the woods, and suddenly you put him into space and turn him into a cyborg, you have officially ran out of ideas. The movie would end with a possible opening to another sequel after Jason lands on what I could assume to be Earth 2 and lands in the lake. Luckily, this would be the final installment of the series. And finally, 2 years later, we would finally get Freddy vs. Jason on the big screen. It took 20 years, and this is what we got. Was it everything you hoped for? Probably not. Movies like this, Freddy vs. Jason, Superman vs. Batman, it doesn't matter. These crossover movies never work. People have so many ideas of what these movies should be about, but when they're actually made and put on the big screen, that's it. That's what you get. There is no imagination behind it, and really they never should have been made. For those of you who haven't seen it, it was almost as if Friday the 13th had been introduced to a lot of the comic killing from Nightmare on Elm Street. In the movie, Freddy Krueger has been defeated after all of the Elm Street children have been taken to a mental facility and given a drug known as Hypnocil to keep them from dreaming until they're 18. Now that no one remembers Freddy, he ain't powerful enough to kill anybody. So he decides to wake up Jason and sends him to Elm Street to go on a killing spree so that everybody remembers who Freddy is so Freddy can become powerful enough. He eventually does, however, every time Freddy tries to kill somebody, Jason beats him to it. So now he needs to shut down Jason. Meanwhile, you got a bunch of teenagers that are caught between the two. After Laurie, the main character, finds out that you can pull things out of the nightmare, she decides to go in and pull Freddy out so that he can have a one-on-one matchup with Jason in the real world. Now, I'm not going to lie, this movie wasn't absolutely terrible, and actually I fully enjoyed the battle between the two at the end of the movie, but it really did not live up to the hype. It did give us two alternate endings, one ending having Jason proving victorious after coming out of Camp Crystal Lake holding the severed head of Freddy in his hand. Okay, an alternate ending would show the two main characters that survived getting a little naughty in the bed, and suddenly the guy raises his hand and you see claws come out of his hand, basically saying that Freddy has survived. This was no doubt to make sure that fans of both franchises were happy. I guarantee that wasn't the case, especially when it came to fans of Jason Voorhees. Kane Hodder had played Jason since Friday the 13th Part 7, and he brought the massiveness of Jason, and it would have been awesome to see him go against Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger. But they decided, we wanted to make the two pretty even. Well, since Kane Hodder stood 6'4" and Robert Englund only 5'10", they had to recast Kane Hodder with somebody that was smaller and scrawnier, and this is the Jason we got. No, that sucked. Fans of Friday the 13th wanted to see this gigantic mammoth Jason that we had over the last few installments to go against the real Freddy Krueger. That would have been it. Instead, they just made a weaker Jason. Why not make a bigger freaking Freddy Krueger? I mean, that's all I'm saying. And also, what about some of the killing that happened in it, especially the one in which Jason snaps a guy's head and pushes him over with a single finger? Are you freaking kidding me? It's stuff like this that really made the movie lose a lot of its points and respect. This would be the final installment of both franchises for quite some time until 2010, when Friday the 13th would get its remake. Now, quite a few people didn't enjoy this movie. I personally enjoyed it. It was not a remake, but actually a reboot with a completely different story. It kind of introduced us to a slightly new version of Jason. The kills were amazing. The sex scenes were amazing. I mean, this movie really lived up to its hype. But quite a few people didn't like it for a few things. First, Jason running. Oh, Jason doesn't run. I beg to differ. In Friday the 13th Part 2, 3, and 4, you can catch Jason running several times. There was also one of the only teenagers he left alive at the very beginning of the movie that he kept alive because she looked like his mother. Jason wouldn't do that. Again, I beg to differ. In Friday the 13th Part 2, Jason actually went into his shack to find Jane there, but Jane had put on his mother's sweater and started acting like his own mother. And Jason believed it so much that he actually lowered his weapon and knelt down so that Jane could actually hit him with the machete. And had he not seen his mother's severed head, he would have believed the entire time. Also, there was Jason using like a bow and arrow and also setting up traps and everything like that. Jason wouldn't do that. Okay, there were a couple times through the earlier installments that Jason did in fact do that. Remember in Friday the 13th Part 2 when the guy ended up getting hung upside down and eventually get his throat slit. But okay, I can see a point that they may have taken Jason a little far when it came to using the bow and arrow, or setting up the traps to ring the bell so he knew where people were in the camp. But this would actually make a lot of sense if you're not the supernatural Jason, but instead more of a survivalist, which is exactly where the writers wanted to take him. Either way, I thought this movie was great, and it really shocked the hell out of me when Danielle Panabaker's character, who I figured would be one of the sole survivors of the movie, actually got impaled by the machete and pulled back into Jason's lair. Now, there has been rumors for years that there was actually going to be a second installment, and I tell you what, if they don't screw it up, they have an opportunity to remake this franchise into a huge success. However, there's been back and forth rumors. There's been rumors that there was a script being made, but none of the scripts are being accepted. And actually, at one point, I heard a rumor that the Friday the 13th series was basically dead in the water. There's another rumor coming out that it's supposed to be released in 2018. I don't know. But I really, really hope that the Friday the 13th franchise continues as long as it remains true to the story. So that's the Friday the 13th franchise. Okay, as a whole, I will say that the movies were actually fairly enjoyable. Yeah, they had their ups and downs, but all in all, they were actually a good franchise. But what do you guys think? Comment down below or hit me up in the email in the description. I want to hear what you guys have to say about any of the Friday the 13th movies or about this episode. Also, I have a few discussion questions I'd like to go over. Number 1. Which of the movies in the franchise is your absolute favorite? Number 2. Do you think they made too many installments? And if so, where do you think they should have stopped? Number 3. Is there any other horror icon that you'd like to see Jason take on in another crossover movie? Number 4. Do you think they should have stopped making Friday the 13th, or should they try to continue? Number 5. If you were put in charge of creating a Friday the 13th movie, whether an origin or a sequel, what would your story be about? Number 6. Do you think it would have been better for the series if Tommy Jarvis had taken over as the killer of the franchise? Anything else you want to discuss, comment down below along with your answers or hit me up in the email. I want to hear and discuss with you guys. Also, while you're down there, comment or email me on what you would like to see in future installments of Entertainment Talk. Until then, this is Adam Davidson. Have a nice day.